especially when the burden of common sense is overlooked. Those seats in the back on opening nights are usually occupied by the critics, those wise purveyors of truth who come to these events to offer we mere mortals the benefit of their wisdom and insight, rather like inviting a fairy godmother to a christening. From my point of view, it would be better to have them on closing nights, when they could practice their undoubtable labor for writing funeral orations. I've come here today to relate a few stories of my life, my work, and some people I've known and loved, but with no pretense of having changed the world or even made it a better place. I'm neither prophet nor sage, pundit or soothsayer. I'm only an actor, a mere storyteller. Maybe not a very good one, but that's what I am. I've spent my life as a storyteller, in theater, on radio, and in motion pictures. I've always loved a good story, especially ones that are rooted in truth and include this storyteller in a prominent role. In the beginning, there was Kenosha. I've never blamed my parents for Kenosha. However, Kenosha has always blamed my parents for me. My mother was a professional musician who taught me to read when I was 3, and to play the piano and violin before I was 5. Then she trot me out to perform in some recital or concert, sometimes as far away as Madison and Milwaukee. She even arranged for me to conduct the symphony orchestra for 3 nights in Chicago when I was 7. I was one of those dreadful little creatures with a baton and tailored tuxedo who went about directing adults as if by some grand entitlement. The word genius was whispered to me as I lay mewling in my crib, and it wasn't until middle age that I even considered that I might not be one. My father was an inventor and a businessman who provided well for his family. However, they separated and divorced when I was 6, and my mother took me to live in Chicago, where she hoped to resume her musical career. She died when I was 9, and I stopped playing music immediately, possibly out of the shock or trauma of her passing, but more likely out of the sheer laziness of not having to practice those scales for hours on end. I was sent to live with my father, who by now had taken up residence in a suite of rooms at the Bismarck Hotel in Chicago. I barely knew my father, but found him to be an intelligent and extremely gregarious gentleman who numbered among his many acquaintances several prominent men of his era. Men who knew the loneliness of achievement and enjoyed the camaraderie of the like-minded. I recall a publisher named Hearst, an imposing figure with a high unicoid voice, who seemingly valued my father's friendship. There were writers, men of letters, among them the contributing editor to the New Yorker magazine, Mr. Alexander Woollcott, University of Chicago's playwright and author, Thornton Wilder, and the great Booth Tarkington, whose finest work, in my opinion, I would years later hope to honor with my second motion picture. I suppose that the die was cast when I was 13. and my father managed to acquire 2 rather good tickets to an opening of Hamlet. He dined early that evening and took a taxi to the theater, my father instructing the driver to drop us at the stage entrance. When we arrived, my father presented his card to the man at the door, along with one of his favorite cigars, a brand he'd long insisted had been named for him, the Dick Wells. Well, the man thanked my father and motioned in the direction of the dressing rooms. And as we made our way up that narrow, crowded corridor, my father appeared to me as some visiting dignitary. His bowler hat squarely upon his head, his gloved hands grasping his cane, his long velvet-collared overcoat flowing along behind him, revealing the ever-present spats marking his progress. My father continued to wear spats long after they had been abandoned by style, perhaps in reference to some finer days. We reached a door marked with a large gold star and the name Mr. Barrymore painted in some flamboyant script. Removing his gloves, my father glanced in my direction, a rather sly smile on his face. Then, easing the door open, inside we could see a man seated on a cane chair, dressed in a maroon-colored velvet robe, his back to us, applying makeup in one of those lighted mirrors. When the man caught sight of my father in the reflection, he literally leaped to his feet, and a booming voice announced, "Dick Wells! Why, you old son of a..." Halting at the potentially offensive word, when he noticed me over my father's shoulder, he continued. "Ah," he said, "and with a young lad in tow." My father grasped the great man's hand and replied with, Jack Barrymore. My, you're looking fit." The 2 men embraced as if 2 long-lost brothers reunited at some family gathering after years of separation. As it turned out that night, through the courtesy of Mr. Barrymore and the obvious influence of my father, I would appear on stage in a speechless role as page. At one point in the show, I was to provide Mr. Barrymore with a goblet of some red liquid, and as he turned to receive it, he moved his face away from the audience and winked at me, granting an approval. When the play was over, we all lined up in front of the curtain, and Mr. Barrymore took several much-deserved bows to a standing ovation. But to my surprise, he came over and took me by the hand and brought me forward to share with him his final bow. Well, I was hooked. For the rest of my life, I would seek but seldom find that feeling of elation that comes with knowing you have met some audience expectation of being entertained. Although I was certainly not fool enough on this occasion to believe it had been by my hand. Back in the great man's dressing room, a gaggle of reporters had gathered and were volleying questions. "What do you think of the Chicago audience?" they said. "Do you plan to make any more movies? What about your brother Lionel and your sister Ethel? Is it true that they're going to be coming to Hollywood to make a film with you?" One of the reporters in the back inquired as to the identity of the young man with whom he'd shared that final bow. Was he perhaps yet another Barrymore, destined for greatness on the American stage? Well, the great man threw back his head and burst into laughter. "The secret is out," he said. "The young man in question is none other than the illegitimate offspring of my sister Ethel." And the Pope. Well, the room erupted in laughter, but there was not a voice to be heard above that of my father, who seemed to have enjoyed the little joke even more than Mr. Barrymore himself. My father died when I was 15, and my world would never again be quite the same. Oh, I know all those stories out there about his eccentricity and his fondness for spirits, but I choose to remember him for his grace and his charm and his love of life. And perhaps if his detractors had known him as I did, his memory would be less demeaned, and possibly even revered, as should it be. My career in theater began when I was 16 in Dublin, Ireland, and progressed back here in America with Catherine Cornell's repertory troupe. And when I partnered with John Houseman, a short, stocky, balding, 34-year-old Alsatian, I was only 19. We worked together at the Federal Theater Group and eventually formed our own Mercury Theater. I did a little radio, too. Started when I was 19 as an unbilled player in New York City. And in 1937 was granted the then vacant part of Lamont Cranston on the popular Blue Coal Shadows thriller. Then in 1938, the Mercury Theater was offered the spot vacated by the Lux Radio Theater as a summer replacement. So we became the Mercury Theater on the air. And of course, you know of the notorious War of the Worlds broadcast from October that year. It would be the movies that would both capture and eventually break my heart. I went to Hollywood in 1939 when I was 24. My contract was with RKO for 2 movies, which I was to write, direct, produce, and star in. The contract was negotiated in New York. And since I didn't much want to make a movie, I pretty much got everything I wanted. There was a little money, and I had to agree to the budgetary process, but mostly I got control, total creative control. No one since von Stroheim had been given that much freedom. The studio wasn't even allowed to see the rushes without my approval. I wanted to make The Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad's classic novella from the late 19th century about the ivory trade in Africa. I spent nearly a year writing the script, designing sets, picking costumes. I wanted to bring my Mercury people out from New York because I thought that faces that hadn't been seen on stage or on the screen before would make the entire story more interesting. But when I couldn't get $50,000 out of the budget, they wouldn't let me make it. I offered to make a 3rd movie at no salary that would have easily covered the shortfall. I suggested the Nicholas Blake thriller, Smiler with a Knife. I wanted to use another of my Mercury players, the statuesque young redhead who'd left the Ziegfeld Follies a year or so before, to join us at the Mercury.